But let me first say congratulations to everyone for reaching our 23rd objective. Let me be honest with you as well. I think when we thought of launching this, we had no idea what we were doing. It largely begins like that. You think of an idea, you think it's a great idea, and you think it will happen easily, kind of thing, and you go about thinking it's going to happen, and then you take it on, and you ask yourselves many times in the process, what have we gotten into? And this has been one of those occasions, but it has been a fantastic moment of of uh, of inspiration for so many. And let me begin by saying today that I would like to dedicate today's session to a friend and colleague who has always reminded me of why we do this work. And that friend and colleague is Farooq Ahmed from Warbi, who passed away last month. Uh, a colleague of his, Anisur, was on the panel, in fact, last week. Farooq Ahmed was a returned migrant worker. And when I first met him in 2004, together with Anis and some of the others, I was quite intrigued by what he had to say. One is the International Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Members of the Family had come into force as international law. And Farooq, as a returned migrant worker, had experienced a lot of challenges in the migration process. He had a health issue and then an operation that went wrong. And then when he came back to Bangladesh, to Dhaka, he went from pillar to post, seeing if he could get justice for his issue. In the process, he came to know of many other migrant workers who were suffering and had been exploited in different ways. And Farooq, together with Anis and other groups of returnees, started Warbi, an organization of returned migrant workers. And I remember in my first visit, Bangladesh was my first visit as the regional coordinator of MFA. And Farooq brought up the issue with me with regard to his case of a medical procedure that went wrong, that had impacted his kidney, and from which he would never be able to recover. And he wanted to take this issue up at the UN level. And at that stage in 2004, I was surprised at how grassroots organizations and return migrants, and at the time when the International Convention came into force as international law, migrants were so full of hope that justice and the rule of law in their regard would prevail. And that was what was the International Convention gave that kind of hope to migrants on the ground. Farooq died never seeing that justice ever happening, and never saw that being fulfilled in his own life, in his own case. But from 2004 that I've known him, he has stood out as a migrant rights activist for justice for other migrant workers. I would like to dedicate today's session to him. He was a man who believed in the work we do. He believed in advocating for justice for migrant workers, and he knew it was an issue that we would have to run from pillar to post, national, regional, and international levels. He knew that different stakeholders would have to come to cooperate to make migration a meaningful, a transforming experience for many. It did not happen so much in his own life, in his personal life, for his own personal problem, but he himself became an instrument of hope and transformation for so many other migrant workers. So I'd like to dedicate today's session to my good friend Farooq, who I miss when I think of the times that we were spent together and the struggles that we have been part of in the past until to this day that we continue with other colleagues of his like Anisur and Saiful and others who went on to form Varbi Development Foundation. The other thing that I would like to remind ourselves about the foundations of this 23 objective series was something that Binod Kadaria, I hope he will join us today, who is also with GRFTD, who said in one of the previous sessions that we had started kind of thing, webinars prior to this first objective. And when Binod said something very pointedly in the time of COVID, and that was in the early days of COVID, and Binod challenged us to look at how multilateralism is failing us in the time of COVID, and how and Binod said at a time when we should be coming together at the international level, states have gone unilaterally. And that was a strong point he made in that webinar, which got me thinking as well as to what does this mean? What does migration mean when we link it up to development and rights and cooperation? How can the issue of migration become a change, become an issue of transformation in the way we see our world, in the way we interact with each other, and in the way we interact on issues of social justice. I would like to thank the entire team, GFRDD, Sada, Rakesh, Feroz, Monica, Ruchi, that whole team of GRFTD that started the series together with us and have continued and given fantastic support in the entire process. Action Committee for joining us in this event and helping us take it to making it a global event and participating in it throughout the process as well. CCRM that brought in the Middle Eastern region on this, and again played a very key role in working on this, and my own team at MFA that went day in and day out trying to look for how to make sure that we have the right panel for every time. So thank you for all. I'd like to thank the co-moderators, starting with the first co-moderator, Rola, who eventually dropped off, but I think is on the call in the session today, for being among the first moderators of the sessions. I'd like to thank Paddy, who came in and has continued. And there were times when I had to ask last minute, Paddy, can you come in for me here? And she was always willing and always helpful and always eager to see how to support this. So thank you to everyone who on the team of co-organizers that made this possible. Thank you to all the participants, the students, and everybody who has been part of this program from the very beginning. You see our numbers at the start already. We've kept an average from objective 1 now to objective 20 to 23. Today we are looking at 141. We've kept an average more or less about 150 to 200, anywhere between that from in these objectives, beginning from the first objective. So it's been a fantastic moment of us trying to socialize the global compact. One of the things that was so important for us is when we realized, CCRM Action Committee, MFA and GRFTD recognized very early that as the COVID set in and as the UN system kicked into its normal kind of process, and the GCM reviews, the regional reviews were being planned and things like that, somewhere in the process we realized, gosh, we seem to be living in a bubble. And we wanted to get out of that bubble. And getting out of that bubble meant socializing the global compact as stakeholders, taking ownership of it, for it, and of it, and seeing how we bring knowledge of the global compact, knowledge of the commitments that the governments have made to the global compact, and to be able to monitor the implementation of the global compact as states come to the regional review and make their reports of how they have been implementing it. So it was just this trying to socialize and get as many stakeholders as possible to be part of this process of realizing that all of society, all of government are not just statements, are not just concepts, but that ownership is up to us as to how we claim that space as stakeholders. In the document, it looks beautiful and it can remain very beautiful language. And that's all it can be. It can never take off. But it takes off when people who are on this webinar, people who have been on previous webinars, the co-organizers, the panelists start saying, Yeah, we are stakeholders and we have a role to play, and we identify our role, identify our niche, and make the global compact happen. So it is in that light we have come to Objective 23, and I really want to thank the panelists today for joining us. We have a very esteemed panel today to start with, and I will go straight to the panel to introduce first very quickly the panelist, so that we can go straight into the session itself. So having said that, I will start now with I will start with Colin Raja as the first panelist. And let me just introduce Colin Raja. Many of you have seen his name. Many of you have communicated with him. Many of you have written to him. Many of you have even probably complained to him, you know, because of wanting to be part of processes and seeing how he can, how in his role he can do the magic he does. And so Colin Raja is the coordinator of the Civil Society Action Committee, which is the largest global platform of civil society organizations and networks. He has played different roles. He has been the coordinator of the global coalition on migration, and he has been at the forefront in leading many of the global engagements of civil society, including in the GFMD and the steering committee on migration. So I'm glad, Colin, that you could make it today to be with us on this session. I know it's very early for you in the morning, but I know that has never stopped you as well. So I'll start with you then, you know. And I've said it is important that we as stakeholders lay claim to a discussion at the global level on migration at national and regional levels as well. So let me start with you as a broad question then to kickstart our discussion. What do you see are the challenges and opportunities that are facing global society as a whole in this period that we have of something like what? We've got something like 8 to 10 months or less than a year, I've heard, in terms of when the international community will come to say, in the International Migration Review Forum, governments will come to say, of all that they have done in regard to implementation of the Global Compact. What do you think would be civil society's role and civil society's challenge in the lead up to the IMRF? Colin?
Thanks, William. Thanks for having me, and it's nice to step out. Interesting to step out from the organizing role into this. I think that's a really interesting question. I think in order to answer that and how we're looking forward to answer that question, I think it's important to also kind of look backwards a little bit of where we're coming from and what this period means for us. And I think there's no other way when we talk about civil society, and it's not just relevant to us in civil society and migration, but the civil society around the world and in all aspects, working on all kinds of issues. One of the critical things that have been facing us for quite a while now is shrinking space in the formal intergovernmental spaces, particularly in the UN, but other places as well. The shrinking space, what I mean is that, and I'm sure many of my civil society colleagues will agree with me, when we talk about shrinking civil society space, we're talking about being able to bring forward a really critical engagement, both to push things forward, but also to make sure that we keep to some of the key principles that we are working for and working towards. And I think this is one of the things that, when we talk about migration, we can look back over the last 10, 15, even 20 years and say we've come a long way in that regard. And in many ways, building up towards now, we've actually achieved a lot together. And this is, we can certainly point to certain personalities, but when you look at it as a whole, civil society has been a critical aspect of that. So the notion of having spaces then shrink for civil society is really a confusing one for many of us. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges when we look at the IMRF, when we look at the possibilities to engage in implementation and beyond that. There are a few spaces, obviously, that we might be able to point to that are slightly different and we can lift up as models. So I think those are the opportunities that we have. The GFMD possibly is one. I think many of us have said that we've fought for having our space in the GFMD when we were completely shut out from the very beginning, and civil society really pushed our way, put our foot through the door and then pushed the door open. And thanks to a number of key member states and other organizations that have supported civil society's engagement, we've now got a space that we can say is our own, and we say we have kind of carved out almost in equal status among other stakeholders as well within the GFMD space. But I think, that's an anomaly when you look across the board. We really have this challenge of a shrinking civil society space. The other thing I also wanted to mention is that I think, when we think about international cooperation and partnerships, when we think about this objective, what it means as a whole, one of the things we have to look at is ourselves as civil society. And here I think we need to be self-critical. And when I look back a little bit, when I look at 2017, 2018, when the Global Compact was being consulted about and being negotiated, I think that was a really important moment for civil society. And I think what has been the case, and William, you mentioned that I've been engaged in global civil society for about 20 years now, and I think I've seen this in many spaces. There are critical moments that sort of make or break us as civil society, that we can either come together or we kind of get pulled apart. And when I look at particularly the negotiations for the Global Compact, I saw it as a critical moment where civil society came together to ensure that we got the best possible compact. And oftentimes people would work with each other, put away their organizational positions and organizational stature to ensure that the greater good was being held to, that we can argue and we can advocate for the best compact we could. So I think, that's a lesson for us. But I think one of the challenges we have since that period, and I think going forward, this is going to be a real, probably the biggest challenge for ourselves, is our sort of inability to recapture that notion of what is the civil society movement as a whole, but looking more towards what's beneficial for me and my organization in that respect. And I think, this is where we possibly, need to reconsider where we are civil society, how we engage with each other, and then how we engage with other stakeholders, with states, with international organizations, with the private sector, and everybody else. Those are questions we need to ask ourselves. So I think, William, you hit the nail on the head that this is a critical period for us. It's a critical juncture. We're not sure how we're going to come out on the other side of this at the end of the IMRF period and going beyond that. I'm not sure that we can reclaim a strong position if we are in the current mode that we are in. And there are other aspects that kind of feed into that. The pandemic has certainly been a huge factor in that, but also how we approach partnerships. And I'm happy to talk more about that, but I just wanted to just put that on the table to say that I'm not very confident that we are in a position that we can get the best role for ourselves as civil society and get the best out of the IMRF the way we are as civil society right now.
Thanks, Colin, for laying it out for us. And I think you're putting before us a very hard truth. We all know that civil society has so many shades. There's a big spectrum in civil society kind of thing. And it's always a challenge in being united, in moving forward, and in bringing together a perspective that goes right down to migrants' voices kind of thing, and bringing that up to a global level. So there's a lot of working together, trust building, cooperation, compromise. There's so much of it that needs to happen in this process going forward. And you're saying you see this process as shrinking for us, and it's critical, I think, because I'm wondering, even as you come to the IMRF, and I think my challenge would be, I guess, to all the panelists as well, this will be the first IMRF, and we know UN systems as well, how states will come and report of everything they've done kind of thing, and it will all look like a success agenda and implementation. But civil society, like governments have said or states have said before, they are able to put forward the hard truth of what are the gaps and what are the challenges. And therefore, it is so important to be able to see, be focused like that and united like that in purpose to see that real implementation has to be transformative. So what are some of the in things that the action committee and others are doing or could possibly be doing moving forward, recognizing this is a challenge?
Well, I think this is true for all of civil society, and regardless who we are and which platform we're in or anything like that. I think one of the things we have to kind of set for ourselves is that the notion that the organizational position takes precedent over everything else. And I think, as good staff people, as good people who want to promote and build our organizations, it's important for us to play that role and enhance our own organizational profiles. But I think a lot of times, in fact, most of the time, we let that get in the way of the actual work and actually accomplishing our mutually shared goals and objectives. When we talk about the IMRF, for example, how do we want to see the IMRF be meaningful to us rather than just a rubber stamping of everything that's already in the books in terms of what states have done, what we have done, what we've accomplished, and just kind of uplifting that. How can we be really critical about what hasn't been done? Where are the gaps? How do we address that? How do we come together to do it? And I think we can only do that if we come together and say, okay, we need to work together. We need to come together. And again, looking backwards in all the years that we were able to achieve that, what are the lessons learned in terms of how we can the strength in building our strength in numbers. When we come together and say, this is what we stand for, this is what we'd like to see, this is what we're critical about, and where we see the gaps are and where we see much work needed to be done, and not pointing the fingers at anyone, but saying, we need to do this together. We're not accomplishing this together. Looking beyond the low-hanging fruit of the objectives and looking some of the ambitiousness of the zero draft and the final draft of the compact. If we look at that, that vision and what the authors and all the negotiators of the compact was trying to achieve, if we really look at that and say, okay, how can we come together to do that? We need to relook and rebuild and restructure ourselves in a much more cohesive and more cooperative manner. And I think, when I'm talking about partnerships, I think the notion of partnerships often is often kind of misleading, because I think a lot of times we think of partnerships being built from mutually beneficial sort of positions. I don't think that's true. I think that might work for a short while, but after a while, that's going to go away. And this is true not just with international partnerships that we're talking about. This is true for business partnerships, for interpersonal partnerships with your spouse, or any kind of partnerships. If we just think about it as being mutually beneficial, sometimes you look at and see that, is this really beneficial for me? And you start questioning that. That sort of goes away. Instead, what I think real partnerships should be built on, and the successful ones are often built on, are two basic foundations. And that one is based on principles, shared principles, and the other is based on mutual trust. The principles, when we look at the Global Compact, we already have the principles there, 23 objectives or 22 plus this one. When we look at that, we say there's a lot of shared principles that we can look to, where we can build from. But the trust is a little bit trickier. In fact, it's a lot harder when we talk about trust, because that's where it starts to break down. That's where we revert to the other notion of okay, how's this beneficial for me? How can we build partnerships to accomplish that? And when we don't really see the benefit for ourselves, we sort of let it go and say, okay, we'll kind of leave that aside. I think it's critical for us to relook at that when we talk about cooperation and partnerships in terms of achievement of what we've achieved and what we've not achieved in the Global Compact. When we review that in an honest way, in a way that really is truthful to the compact itself, I think we need to rethink about how we look at partnerships, particularly how we build on those shared principles and how we develop that trust with each other, first of all, between civil society and then with civil society and other stakeholders.
Thank you, Colin, for that. And that's very wise words in saying, as we even prepare now for the IMRF to put these principles of trust and cooperation and these elements of working together, because at the end, the objective should be, when we look at IMRF, that the implementation has to be meaningful to us and to migrants. I think that's a very key point that you have raised. I also like the use of the word ambitiousness in this first in the implementation. I think now more than ever, we need to be ambitious. We need to be imaginative. The world has been brought to its knees in this time, and more than ever before, cooperation, collaboration, partnerships are words that we have to rediscover, that have to go off the paper and become real in our own lives and working. And thank you for the challenge that you have put before civil society. And I think it's very apt to go also, therefore, to the next panelist. And I will ask His Excellency Poem to come in here. And Poem Mudwaya Bikwa. That's right, Poem. I'm sorry, but I hope I got that right. Yeah. He is a minister counselor at the Zimbabwe Permanent Mission to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva, responsible for migration, humanitarian and labor issues. And I must say, I have seen Poem engage in many intergovernmental processes, and I've always been impressed how much he goes back to always saying, what is the framework that you are using? And he will always say, ILO standards, rights-based framework. He always reverts to that. He always reverts to the principles around which cooperation should happen. So it's great to have Poem with us today on this panel. And I will ask you, based on even what Colin is saying, Poem, and I started by saying that one of our colleagues at the start of COVID had already triggered this question of multilateralism failing in the time of COVID. The question I will ask you is, the COVID situation, therefore the pandemic, has it been an impediment to international cooperation as envisaged under Objective 23 of the GCM?
Thank you, William. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening all. This question appears like it's a straightforward one, whose answer is simple and predictable. But unfortunately, this is not the case. Besides, a good answer to the question has to be supported by contextualized empirical evidence. It is therefore necessary to critically examine the pros and cons of the implementation of Objective 23 juxtaposed with the COVID-19 pandemic. The answer to the question, William, the moderator, may be located in one of the following three scenarios or possibilities. The first possibility is the effect or consequence scenario, premised on the thesis that the pandemic has effects on Objective 23. The second scenario is the enabler scenario, which is grounded on the proposition that the pandemic provides an impetus for strengthening the international cooperation under Objective 23. The third and last scenario is the no effect or no consequence scenario, which is anchored in the idea that the pandemic has no effects on the implementation of Objective 23. At face value, this one may sound far-fetched, but for scholars and students, it is a thesis worth pursuing just like the other two. In brief, the GCM was adopted in December 2018, and in 2019, member states, the UN Network on Migration and other stakeholders, in this case, including civil society organizations, were preoccupied with crafting its implementation modalities. In the case of the UN Network on Migration, the modalities included the establishment of the Migration Multi-Party Trust Fund to support member states, I guess member states and other stakeholders. Thus, funding is a central idea in the three scenarios. When COVID-19 was declared a public health emergency of international concern in March 2020, member states and regional bodies were still reviewing their respective migration policies, laws, and practices with a view to aligning them to the GCM. This explains why the implementation of the GCM was not yet in full swing in 2020. However, not all principles in the GCM are new. In some cases, it is or it was a question of rehashing the existing ones or simply tweaking here and there, repackaging or redirecting them to new realities like the climate change phenomenon. From a global policy standpoint, it was deemed desirable to have all aspects of international migration in one framework as a basis for member states to recommit themselves to address international migration challenges triggered by large movements of migrants. That's over 114 million people have been infected with the virus and more than 2.5 million people have succumbed to it. The figures include international migrant workers, as the virus in course does not discriminate. In general, the national lockdowns and travel restrictions imposed by some member states to mitigate the spread of the virus has effects on migrant workers and migrants in transit. However, the extent of the impact of the lockdowns and travel restrictions on Objective 23 has to be established through research. So without a research, we can't conclude that there's an impact. A significant percentage of the international migrants projected to be over 280 million lost jobs and livelihoods during the first wave of the pandemic. In the same period, some migrants who opted to return faced a host of challenges. The good news is that some of the migrants who returned received support from IOM. I can quote the example of Zimbabweans who returned from South Africa and Botswana, the neighboring countries, Ethiopian returnees from the Middle East. I also read about the Nepalese returnees from India, who to some extent got support from IOM. So the support from development partners and the governments should be explored in the context of bilateral, regional, and multilateral cooperation covered in under Objective 23. On 1st December 2020, while launching the first biennial report of the implementation of the GCM entitled From Promise to Action, the UN Secretary General acknowledged the negative impact of the pandemic on the implementation of the GCM in general, obviously including Objective 23. However, he acknowledged some positive aspects associated with the pandemic, as he said, I quote, whereas COVID-19 has disrupted efforts to implement the GCM in many areas, it has also spared the adoption of some supportive policies, close quote. Suspension of forced returns by some countries is cited as one such supportive policies. But what is debatable, in my view, is whether or not the international community shifted its attention from other areas that need global cooperation to the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, some global leaders, including the UN Secretary General, talked about lack of a global approach to mitigate the pandemic. Even today, there are issues relating to vaccine nationalism and versus vaccine equity. However, member states and regional communities such as the European Union and the African Union, I guess a similar arrangement in Asia Pacific was also involved in prioritizing the pandemic. Furthermore, a lot of member states took heed of the call by the IOM Director General to include migrants in their national COVID-19 response and recovery frameworks. Notwithstanding the foregoing, it seems irregular migration has continued to characterize the migration landscape amidst the pandemic. We hear about migrant caravans from South America to the United States of America, clandestine entrance to the United Kingdom by migrants from Calais in France, and several deaths of African migrants in the Mediterranean Sea attempting to reach to Europe. In conclusion, Mr. Moderator, if you are to do justice to the question, we need to focus on all the 5 sub-objectives of Objective 23 in order to ascertain the extent to which each of them has been affected by the pandemic or has been enabled by the pandemic itself. In any case, the objectives constitute the member states' commitments and actions under Objective 23 that are worth exploring in the context of the question. This can be done as the discussion unfolds. I thank you for listening. Thank you.
And thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I think you have pointed out very important issues, and I like what you have said, which I think there may have been a reluctance to for as well, in the sense of I like what you have said about looking at the implementation of Objective 23 with using the COVID context as a challenge, as a lens to look at it through, kind of thing. And you have cited several instances like the repatriations, workers stranded, the issue of the vaccines, irregular migration, and you have looked at all of these different situations and issues that have come up in the time of the COVID, and you have asked for an evidence-based approach towards saying, yes, there has been international cooperation in the implementation, and particularly in this time of COVID. I like that approach, and I'm wondering as a follow-up question that now that the regional reviews are happening, and the Middle Eastern one happened last week, Asia one is happening around next week. As the regional reviews are happening, do you have a sense of, and with your own African review that will be held, with a regional review that will be held in preparation for the IMRF, is there a recognition of states, because a lot of the reviews are happening with states coming and reporting about what they have been doing in terms of implementation. How much of that reporting is really about cooperation? Have you a sense of where at least even in the African region, there is more, where Objective 23 is used as guidance for implementation of the Global Compact? Poem, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William, for the follow-up question. Certainly, like I indicated in my presentation, very little seems to have been done in terms of giving effect to the GCM in general. And if you look at Objective 23, it is very specific. It's calling for international cooperation, and examples are cited. And this gives you an idea about how it came about. I remember, William, you were following the intergovernmental negotiations. This particular objective was not supported when it was flagged by other member states, because initially it was like calling upon the developed world to support the developing countries, especially small island states which are affected by climate change. So it was basically about resources coming from the developed world to the developing countries to support such kind of projects. So this explains why initially it was resisted. It had to be, during the negotiations, were to agree on a diluted kind of paragraph because of the concerns of funding. And by funding, we're basically looking at multilateral organizations to fund such kind of projects. So to the extent that at this juncture, very little has been done in terms of funding or cooperating along those lines. The attention this time around, because of COVID-19, has been on protection of migrants themselves in host countries or during return journeys, and of course, to some extent, integration. So I wonder whether, in fact, even during the regional reviews, a lot has been said about Objective 23. For me, be it the last objective, I see a situation, it will be the last one to be fully given effect to by member states, given its orientation. And of course, the circumstances. The attention obviously has shifted from purely international migration issues to deal them within a context, and the context is the COVID. So we don't expect a lot of ground to have been covered in terms of giving effect to Objective 23, and that will be reviewed during the regional reviews. You have said you have had your own, and another one is happening is it in the Middle East, and the African one will be coming soon. But we have to see. But fortunately for the African one, I happened to be in conversation with the colleagues in Southern Africa in terms of preparing for the review. It appears, unfortunately, very little has been done in terms of Objective 23. I rest my case. Thank you.
No, thank you, sir. I think what you have put before us is a very sobering truth. A very sobering truth. And thank you also for pointing out, for those who were not in the negotiations or who did not have a chance to follow the negotiations, Poem has pointed out to a very important point in the deliberations, is that in the first drafts, there were Objective 23, there was no Objective 23. In fact, Objective 23 was put in much late into the conversation, into the negotiations. And like Poem said, it was immediately interpreted as an objective that is looking for funds from the developed world to the developing world kind of thing. But it was to the credit of the negotiators that some of them went on to spell that out, that it is not about funds alone kind of thing. Cooperation means much more than that. And I'm saying that Poem has put a very sobering truth before us, because Objective 23 is about cooperation to make migration work. Migration is about crossing of borders. And if it means it, so by its very essence, it requires states across the different borders to be able to look at this mobility that is happening, whether it is happening across immediate land borders, whether it is happening at the regional level, or whether it is happening at the continental level. So in many ways, Objective 23 becomes a very important objective to focus on, to make real all the other 23 objectives. So in some ways, I think it's a very important objective, and Poem has pointed out to that. So I do hope that we will, in the course of today's discussion, we'll try to figure out what this means, therefore, for us who are looking at the implementation of and gearing up for the IMRF, to see what this would mean, therefore, in terms of making migration a transformative experience for all, a win-win-win for all kind of thing. I think this is going to be a very key objective to look at, and a very sobering objective to look at as we come towards implementation. And that is why I will move on now to my next panelist. And we've got that perspective of international cooperation. And now I'll move on to our next panelist, and I'll invite Sumaya Islam. And Sumaya Islam is the Executive Director of Bangladesh Nari Shramik Kendra, BNSK, which is a women workers center. And I must say, I'm very grateful that Sumaya could make it today, because she has, in this period of the COVID, Sumaya is known in the region as being a women's activist for migrant workers. So and she has been tireless in her efforts on this. It has amazed me how she has defied even the COVID, and every time every week she's sending a picture of herself in some different part of Bangladesh on the ground with migrants, with women, trying to do a capacity building program or a training or reach out in terms of humanitarian aid. And it amazes me how the COVID and the restrictions have not seemed to have stopped her enthusiasm or her passion to reach out to migrants and women migrant workers. So thank you for being able to make it in this webinar today, Sumaya. And let me, I don't, is Sumaya here? I don't see her. Sumaya? Oh, don't tell me she's dropped.
Yes. Good
Okay.
afternoon.
All right. So, okay, great, Sumaya, you are here. Okay, so let me ask you then, as you work on the ground and you're working with women migrant workers, this big global comprehensive GCM document kind of thing, because the objective of our series was also to get all stakeholders, particularly migrants, engaged in the implementation. How far do you think we have been successful in bringing the compact to the ground, and what the ground is saying about the compact, bringing that to the ears of policymakers? Your thoughts on this, Sumaya?
Thank you so much. Thank you for give a chance to join us as your speakers. But for your question, it is very important that in the ground, our 23 objective is more focused on strengthening the cooperation issues. And the ground level, as a grassroots level organization, what we are seeing, the cooperation with the migrant workers that not is implementing in the ground level, grassroots level. But it is important for GCM implementation. Bangladesh only has done the national plan, but for implementation of GCM 23 objective, we should make more strengthening cooperation to grassroots level, national level, and regional level. And if we can do that one, that can support migrant workers a lot. But during the COVID time, what we are seeing that migrant workers suffering for COVID, and already MFA has done a huge work on waste theft issue, and that is why that is happening, because of there is not cooperation between global level, and that is not implementing for the migrant workers. And when they are in country of destination, then they are not getting the justice. They need more support, and support not only from the embassy people. There is international organization. By this time, we know that different organizations supporting migrant workers, and the UN and government and the other civil organization, even the network. So what is this our experience is to implement GCM 23 objective is more important to support the migrant workers.
Yes, and I know that in this period of the COVID, Sumaya, that you have been helping a lot of returned women or repatriated women migrant workers. And I know you have been going to different institutions at the local level, including the National Human Rights Commission, in raising some of the issues of returned women migrant workers. And do you see that your efforts in asking for some of these concerns of migrant workers to be addressed, do you see the state moving, do you see at the other end countries of destination that have been dependent on Bangladeshi women migrant workers? Do you see a positive response from that end? Or are you able to see resolution of some of the work and the cases and the issues that you are bringing forward in this time of COVID? Are you seeing some resolution to some of these cases in terms of international cooperation?
Yes, thank you, Liam. Yes, we are seeing that one in the during COVID time last March when we saw in the Bangladesh. From Bangladesh, we are civil society organization move forward with all. This is our all advocacy effort. This is not only from BNSK, that our government increased budget for migrant workers who is suffering in country of destination. And we have seen that one, especially for the embassy of Jordan, ambassador personal initiative helps migrant workers a lot. Even our Minister of Expected Welfare increased the budget. And we visited our minister and our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister of Expected Welfare. Even we spoke to Senior Secretary of Minister of Finance. So then they realized that increasing near about 700 crore reintegration program package from government side. This is from government initiative. Another thing is from our side, we work closely with National Human Rights Commission, and you was in several meetings, and that is from our POCAR support that Shri Lira was there, and how we can make the voice for undocumented workers. Still we are working. Last week we visited the National Human Rights Commission office for the Lebanese migrant worker. Near about 5,000 migrant workers technically were there and someone in jail. So government, National Human Rights Commission, and other civil society organizations who are working in Lebanon and even in Jordan. So we are working on that one. But this is very important. When we can make voice and noise in the ground, then cooperation and support increase. And we learn a lot from migrant from Asia, and you are our boss.
Thanks, Sumaya. And I think, yes, you have given a very good example of cooperation among stakeholders at the national level. And I'm glad you've identified different stakeholders, because sometimes when we talk of government, we think of it as just one body kind of thing, but you have enumerated several kind of different government line agencies that you all collaborate with and different stakeholders and things like that. I will ask you to think about this as I come back to you with another question later on, is that all your work, and I have seen that this fantastic work that has been done in pushing the government, Bangladesh government, to respond to some of the issues that you have raised. But have you all been successful in getting the Bangladesh government to become more aggressive, or let me say more engaging or more progressive in its reaching out to the country of nation in addressing some of these issues together and collaboratively with the Bangladesh government? What kind of response from the host countries that the Bangladesh government has been able to get? I'll give you time to think about that as I move on to the next panel and call you again to respond to that question.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
And that is why I move on then to my next panelist. And my next panelist is a man who many of us know very well for many years, and many of us have laughed and enjoyed time together with him, and amazed by the energy he has put in so many different spaces that he has also opened up for us. That is John Bing, who is the Geneva representative of the NGO Committee on Migration. John is a migrant himself. I love the way you did your bio, John, and there's things that I'm coming to know about you now only, even if we met as early as 2006. But John is a migrant himself, the grandchild and great-grandchild of migrants born in famine years in Ireland and sugarcane plantations. He has worked in community organization at local and global level since 1989, including with Cambodian refugees. He has been on the ICMC team together with others in the International Steering Committee, MFA, Colin from the Action Committee, and so many others in bringing forward civil society perspective. John's latest stint has been with the IOE, in which he has worked with private sector as well to get private sector, whom we have been working with for the longest time, to say, get on to this. This is important. You're an important stakeholder. Get on to this agenda. And John has been a strong advocate for that. John is a lawyer by profession, and I did not know this, a long time a vice president of a Wall Street investment bank as well. So in many ways, a very good perspective, a very holistic kind of perspective of engagement from different stakeholders. But John, sitting today in this in this situation where all of us are working from home, where the home is now become the workspace, because we can't just go out. We can't even go to our regular offices and meeting spaces and things like that. And then you look at this journey that we have made from the time that some of us were engaged in calling for the adoption, the ratification of the Migrant Workers Convention, and having it ratified, coming in form as international law, then the GFMD series, now the Global Compact series. There's been a lot. In some ways, some of us looking back will say there's been a lot of progress that has been, a lot of movement that has been. My question to you then, John, is today as you sit and reflect, are we moving forward fast enough? Or are we moving backwards while thinking we are moving forward? Floor is yours, John.
Well, thanks for the easy question, William. And when you talk about energy, these 23 webinars is something like 150 to 400 participants each time, and 130 different speakers and moderators across governments and mayors and civil society and academics, youth, business, a huge percentage of migrants and diaspora. Well, congratulations is all I can say. I think your question, are we moving forward fast enough? Absolutely not. I would even add, are we ourselves moving ourselves fast enough? And I think an honest sense for most of us, certainly for me, myself, is no, we're not moving ourselves fast enough. I liked what Colin was saying about the importance of figuring out how we approach partnerships together in civil society. I liked what you said, William, about how we push for partnerships with business, among others. I see Sophie von Hazen, so active with the mayors, is in the meeting here as well. How we push for partnerships and cooperation with mayors. The next speaker from IOM, Nicoletta Giordano, how do we push for more and better cooperation and partnerships with international organizations? And of course, Minister Councillor Poem from Zimbabwe, very active in the Global Forum and other processes. How do we work more and better together so that we move forward faster? But your other question was, do we have a sense of moving forward at all, or does it feel like we're moving backward? I think there's backward movement in a lot of places. I think there's reversals where even some movement forward has turned around and gone the wrong way. But the opposite is true also, where there's not only movement forward, but where there's been a reversal from backward movement for more forward movement. And I think the Global Compact is right there. It's evidence of that. And the Global Compact is not just an international product. The Global Compact was negotiated by states with participation from their capitals, civil society at grassroots level, through all the other levels, business, mayors, and others. Objective 23 on cooperation and partnership is the Compact's final and uniting objective. It's the motor. It's the motor for all the other 22 objectives. Even if it was added last, cooperation runs through it all and carries it and should carry it forward and faster, or not at all. But it always struck me as strange that they put cooperation in the back at the end. It's almost like the Volkswagen cars that had the motor in the back. But it calls us to better partnering for faster movement. And I think we want to remember that the Compact itself is an example of a stream and years of cooperation and partnership between all the actors at all the levels. This webinar is also a clear example of cooperation and partnership, the kind that brings the Compact to life, William, as you said, that takes us out of the bubble, that will give faster possibility for implementation of the Compact. So hats off to you, Migrant Forum in Asia, and the Civil Society Action Committee, the Cross-Regional Center for Refugees and Migrants, and the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism. Zoom is not just an online platform, it's also the speed that we can move at when we partner like this together. And I think even as we're different in our organizations and networks, the NGO Committee on Migration in New York that I represent, together we're unity of purpose, presence, partners, power, and possibility. And how can we not be energized when we know that? And more, William, and others on the line from Warby. Thank you for mentioning Farooq. Thank you for mentioning him. You know, there's an expression that says, hope has two lovely daughters. Hope has two lovely daughters, anger and courage. And we're there. And Farooq was there, and we're there. But what's important with this global compact is that we're not where we were. We're not where we were last year when we began this series. We're not at the beginning of COVID. Maybe we're in the awful middle. Maybe we're headed closer to the end, but we're not at the beginning. We've seen the pandemic raise possibilities like we've never seen before, urgent possibilities and sometimes opportunities to act in ways we haven't. Pandemics like environment and climate change don't see borders. So it's either act multilaterally or die. Now, migration is different. Migration is not a threat like a pandemic or environment and climate change. It's an opportunity for multilateral action. And when migration is more decent, it benefits migrants in countries, whether they're origin, destination, or transit. And I think we have to see that. I think Compact Objective 23 calls explicitly for regional and multilateral action. Regional action has to be tested to make sure that resources are fairly there. I think that's what Minister Council Pong was referring to a few minutes ago. And multilaterally, sure, we're seeing that severely tested in COVID time with closed borders and vaccine nationalism. But again, we're seeing some seismic positive shifts also amid the COVID horror. We see widespread new views of essential workers and essential employers and possible shifts on public narratives of migration too. And we see the importance of migrants and migration to recovery. Talk about something we need to claim and own and insist on. The importance of migrants and migration to recovery. Migrants with rights, migrants with the dignity of their labor, with the unity of their families, but migrants where they are is important, even essential to recovery. We're in year 3 of the Global Compact. Will you make references to the regional review processes and the very imminent international review processes. But in year 3, we're past the probation period, past the initial proving and testing period. It's just about over. And this webinar series that so clearly signal that the Global Compact is alive and that we own it. We all own it. So it's no longer enough to just look for fault or gaps or even slowness in what the Compact says or does. While we still have to do that, we need to raise up and expand the solid practices and partners that fill the large number of gaps that the Compact addresses. So we're not where we were. COVID time teaches us that great progress is urgent and possible. As you put it, William, change is upon us. Change is upon us. So here's the question, I'll stop here. The question across states, civil society, international organizations, business mayors, are we doing enough partnering? Are we doing enough partnering in migration and development to make it the change needed? That's the question of Objective 23. That's the question for us. That's the question Farooq put to us and is holding us accountable for.
Thanks a lot, John, and thank you for those insights. I really like what you have said, and you know what, you have provoked again to think that, I mean, Objective 23 being the unity objective is the motor that drives all the other objectives. I've said as well is there are so many urgent possibilities that are before us now. You know, I like what you've said, that we must act in ways like we haven't before. That it is now the time to act multilaterally or die. I think these are very, very honest and hard statements for us to grapple with. You have made Objective 23 so real. And I think from beginning with Colin and then Poem and Sumaya and yourself, this what seems to be echoing is that it is time to act. And I'm recognizing that each one of you is saying that we might be acting, but not enough. We are not responding to the urgency that is at hand. And we might lose along the way. And I like what you've said about the right to recovery. I think this is so important, that this notion of the right to recovery is something that is spelled out in multilateral spaces, in the spaces like the regional reviews, and is held as one of the rights that we explore in the IMRF. So I will put this question to you then as a follow-up question, John, where do you see the critical partnerships? Well, we've now got a whole kind of, and like Colin was saying, partnerships is the new fashionable word kind of thing, and we say partnership, and not get into the real substance of partnership, what it means kind of thing. So, as somebody who has seen and pushed for this idea as well, what are some of the critical partnerships in leading up to the IMRF?
Yeah, thanks, William. Briefly, when I say we are not where we were, I mean, that's so obvious to so many of us, and for many of us in painful ways. But in migration, there are also many ways in which that's positive and challenging. And for civil society in particular, if we're not perfect, we're at least awake on some of these issues. So examples, I think, of cooperation and partnering in COVID time include some things already underway where partners include national governments, maybe not enough, but national governments are there. So the movement, for example, on essential workers, on regularization, sometimes for temporary periods, sometimes for longer periods, sometimes for people who are already in application processes or asylum processes, sometimes for undocumented. But the regularization of essential workers and a wide and widening range of essential workers has been quite conspicuous, much more than many of us imagined even a year or so ago, when all we ever encountered was a reaction to the word regularization like it was poison. The same reaction we saw 10 years ago to the word rights, like it was poison, just to have an example of another word and reality and principle, as Colin put it, that's moved. Not enough, but considerably from where it was. So regularization, do we need to invest more there? Alternatives to detention, in an area like regularization where there's been some strong work from civil society partners in particular, and some strategic work with governments, practical focus, not just on gaps, not just on the principles themselves, but on practical steps. And so the challenge for us is, can we make more of those changes on regularization and alternatives to detention, and more permanent? Are we doing enough there? Do we seek enough partners, sometimes surprising partners, or as Laxam Basname said at the last webinar last week, do we even work with the necessary partners enough on this? Access to services, regardless of status, including firewalls. Again, a word that's been so difficult that was impossible in the negotiation of the Global Compact. But suddenly we see it in the horror of COVID. Suddenly a light starts to flicker, and it's one we've looked for. Access to health services in so many countries, surprising countries, to migrants regardless of status. Now we got to work on and make sure of vaccines, regardless of status. Are we doing that? Are we cooperating among ourselves? Are we seeking partners? Sometimes the surprising but necessary partners for that. For recovery, you mentioned the right to recovery, William. Absolutely. But are we seeing there, right now, and for these next 2 years, maybe 3, are we seeing that the mutual interest that like I think Colin referred to this, the mutual interest that brings partners together, the common ground there may be on pathways for migration, on skills recognition and mobility, on fixing recruitment, on new technologies that help in all of those ways, on recovery of unpaid earnings. Are we seeing and coming together enough on that? All of that's in the Global Compact in one way or another. And all of that either already does or can benefit from some partnerships across states, civil society, mayors, and business. William, you mentioned that you gave me much too much credit in the introduction for bringing business along. Let me tell you, when I went to work with the International Organization of Employers 6 months ago, temporarily covering for the coordinator of business for the Global Forum, I was astounded to see how many of the top priorities of the employers were the same as some of the top priorities in civil society. Pathways for legal migration, expanding them, recognition and mobility of skills, fixing recruitment, technology. So 4 things I mentioned before. There's so much common ground on that. And I think Sophie van Hazen and others from the mayor's side would say the same. Why aren't we sewing a new flag and making 4 times the number of flags we've had before, and making sure that business and mayors are also carrying them, and we march forward with them together. But so recovery. Lastly, development actors. You know, going into a recovery, development is the new name for recovery. Sustainable development is the new name for recovery. And I think we have to spend time thinking at that, not to build back better, but to build forward better. Civil society always has the forward vision, and that's not any different for recovery. But are we doing that? Are we leading the charge, or are we getting lost back in someone else's crowd and agenda, in what Colin referred to as shrinking space? Are we asserting our own space under our own vision of recovery? And that very much involves the kind of protection of migrants and protection of decent migration that we've been talking about.
Once again, thanks a lot for that, and thank you for pointing out that there are so many areas of collaboration. While I posed the question to you, thinking of critical kind of stakeholder partnerships, I like how you approached it as areas of partnership, and you've enumerated several areas of partnership, kind of thing, on technology, on pathways, irregular migrants, on access to health and services. There are so many areas of partnership that we can focus on. And I think that would be the way to go. I think that's where I like what you said. We've got to go out and see there who's doing what. And sometimes it surprises us. Like you said, you were surprised when you went over in the IOE that there is so many similarities. Sometimes we've got to get out of our own boxes and see who is out there doing something, like Colin says, kind of thing, and working out with them in how can we move forward an agenda on this. And sometimes it requires that hard look at how do we move things forward. I really like the idea of.
And William, sorry, one last thing, and never to expect that partners are perfect, that they're perfect.
That's right.
You know, not to stop because we've got small differences or differences on something else. If there's a convergence on what most matters, we can figure out with partners how to run forward. Partners are never identical. They're never forever. and they're never perfect. But if we can figure out enough of the convergence, then we can move faster in response to your question from before.
And that's a good point as well, in the sense of, yeah, you said it's the Objective 23 is the motor. And a motor, all it depends on how much you put your foot down on the pedal and accelerate process. And you recognize that there are times you've got to lift your foot the pedal, and there are times you've got to just press it hard. But it's about knowing how, having the instinct of moving forward. And thank you for that, and identifying also one other actor crucial at this time of COVID moving forward, and that is our development actors. I don't think we talk enough to them. Sometimes as civil society, we talk to them as our donors kind of thing, but I think it's so important that we start looking at development partners and development agencies and hold them accountable to the realization also of the Global Compact, and particularly Objective 23. I'll come back to you, and I will move on to our next panel, and that is Nicoletta Giordano. Let me say, we were supposed to have Michelle Klein-Solomon. It is very unfortunate that she was not able to join us because of a very big emergency in her family at the personal level. And she expressed her regrets because she really, really wanted to be part of this, this conversation today, but it was not possible. And then we are so thankful to Nicoletta, who Colin, I know, was back and forth with for so many hours kind of thing, to see if it could be possible for Nicoletta to join us, and for Nicoletta agreeing to be part of this, even if it came at a very last moment. And I don't know how much she had and what she had to juggle to be with us on this panel. But Nicoletta is head of the International Partnerships Division within the International Cooperation and Partnership Department of the IOM, headquarters in Geneva. She was also chief of mission in Yemen and Albania and Uganda, and also worked with IOM Kenya. And she's also had a stint with UNDP and other in Bangladesh, and also with IFAD. So she's got a good experience on looking at all the UN system and the different agencies, and now with International Partnerships Division, to look at what is involved in bringing different stakeholders together. So Nicoletta, let me ask you then, and I know that you have been a silent listener in this 23 Objective series. I've always seen your name, at least often seen your name. So let me ask you then, as you, because the IOM is also the kind of secretariat to the UN network for the implementation of the Global Compact, as the IOM and in your role, in the implementation, and based on what you've heard some of the other panelists say so far, how do you see moving forward? How do you see the building of partnerships? How do you see it? Let me just put it like this. How do you see International Objective 23 becoming bigger and bigger and bigger?
Thank you. Well, first of all, yes, my apologies that I'm here, because Michelle was, like all of you, intimately involved in the development of the GCM. And so it's a pity that she cannot be here. And yes, of course, partnerships, coordination. I have to coordinate internally. We're internationalization. And so we're all fighting for whom should be here today. And I won the battle. So here I am. I mean, I shouldn't say I won the battle, because you've been very generous in extending invitations to IOM colleagues, both in Geneva as well as from field offices. So, if there's a partnership to be praised, this is one of them. And I join my previous speakers in congratulating you for having made it this far. And then you say it isn't finished. There are more objectives to be discussed. I get, here I am, thought I would have a UN presentation, and then I hear all of these veterans on GCM development. And I get all of these, therefore, these ideas of what I should say instead. So please tell me if I don't make any sense. But first of all, yes, Objective 23 is the motor. It's in fact not the motor, it's the glue that keeps all the other objectives together. And I think that's a better, or I suggest that perhaps you might consider this as a better description. not by any chance, or let me quote him, please, the UN Secretary General report, 2 years into the implementation of the GCM, so from promise to action, the Global Compact, highlights the impact of this cooperative framework into 2 years. So, so it is recognized that in and of itself a cooperative framework. And that's why perhaps it was taken for granted that cooperation or international cooperation was taken for granted. And in fact, it is just as well that it was, in fact, not only a cross-cutting principle, but also an objective in and of itself, and not to be taken for granted too much, but that if there is no partnership, if there is no cooperation, there's nothing we can do together. But if there's one thing that the GCM has perhaps instilled in not in new veterans, but in us veterans on the UN side, is that unless we work together, we won't go anywhere. And there's nothing like the Global Compact to emphasize the fact that it's a multi-stakeholder effort. So yes, I've been hearing the pendulum swing from ambitious to we haven't done enough, etc., etc. It's true. The GCM text is ambitious, was ambitious for the times, but just as well we got it done, because if it had come any later, the situation would have changed, and who knows what would have happened. And so I think we need to be, we need to be cognizant of the fact that we got it there just in time, and also cognizant of the fact that, thanks God, there is a GCM, or let's be refreshed that there is a GCM, because it is a bit of a litmus test also with respect to COVID. So I just, and to the challenges that COVID has thrown on all of us. And let me just, because I'm here, perhaps from the side of the UN, I wanted also to highlight, Colin is keen to point out that there's a shrinking civil society space, or shrinking space for dialogue. It's true that there's many more constrictions, and that there's perhaps a digital divide that keeps us all apart more than we should be. And let's not forget that cooperation is not just about getting together and discussing things, but it's also doing things together, more importantly. And so in that respect, the UN itself recognized that that it has an obligation to protect and promote civic space. And in fact, a guidance note was issued by the UN in September 2020, recognizing the obligation by UN agencies and UN entities to protect civic space. So is that a hopeful step, or is it a recognition that in fact civil space was at risk? So I will not go through this guidance note, but it's important to note that it is there, and it was issued by the Secretary General himself. Now, another thing that I'd like to point out, in this pendulum of are we cooperating enough? No, we're not. Are we going fast enough? Is the GCM progressive, advanced enough? Why is it that Objective 2030 is only at the end and not at the beginning? Well, in fact, if it's important to know what it is that we're going to do together. Colin referred to shared principles and mutual trust, and the question of actually articulating the principles in order to then agree on partnerships. But it's true, what partnerships, John was talking about, have we looked at all the partnerships? Well, it is, partnership is a very challenging concept. Just, if you look at the many stakeholders that the GCM, the GCM text actually numbers, I mean, let me just read them out. Cooperation and partnerships with migrants, civil society, migrant and diaspora organizations, faith-based organizations, local authorities and communities, the private sector, trade unions, parliamentarians, national human rights institutions, the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movements, academia, the media, and other relevant stakeholders. I suppose that the other relevant stakeholders are actually the governments, because after all, the GCM is led by governments. But is there enough space for everybody? And what are the permutations on partnerships? So perhaps these are some of the questions that need to be asked. And should we go along, sail along the usual channels of partnership, or should we look for others? And I heard with much interest John Bingham refer to partnerships with the private sector. Well, in fact, it's not even partnerships with the private sector, but the important role of the private sector in driving some of the partnerships. Some of the interests in having regular, safe, and orderly migration. The advocacy, the silent advocacy that is done. The essential workers. The fact that all of a sudden in Europe nobody was actually tilling the land, and migration became the only way to get a few things done, a few essential things done, a few basic services provided, etc., etc. So yes, there's a lot to do. The GCM was ambitious, and cooperation partnerships are the glue. But there's many of us, there's many actors, and I think all deserve consideration. And yes, we need to think out of the box on how to partner together. And perhaps COVID has given us that impetus to look at the same old thing in a different way. And how can we do it? Perhaps, I wouldn't say more efficiently, but perhaps more effectively. So I just wanted, again, because I'm representing a number of colleagues that delegated me, to also refer to what, to a few examples of cooperation or partnership with respect to the implementation of the GCM through the UN Migration Network. Multi-stakeholder engagement is in fact promoted also within the working groups of the network. There are a number of core working groups where a number of different actors come together, share experiences, and look at innovative ways. The multi-partner trust fund is built on a multi-stakeholder approach. The regional reviews, yes, the much criticized regional reviews of the GCM implementation. And yes, perhaps the regional reviews, and we've only had 2 for the moment, and surprisingly, we've had the first one in Europe, perhaps one of the most diverse, extensive regional area of the world. And surprisingly, the first review was done in Europe. And the second one, as just mentioned, in the Middle East and North Africa region. These are regions that are not necessarily that have a lot of narrative and a lot to say about migration in view of the various flows, trends, impacts, destination, transit, origin. So a lot to be said, but perhaps not the most uniform regions of the world to discuss migration issues and to look at partnerships. And yet they happened, and the reviews themselves are an example of partnership, perhaps only at the dialectic level rather than at the cooperation level. But it's only when you bring people together and compare notes that then you can look for cooperation, and it's not before, of course. And yes, you're right, that possibly, I was trying to say, our lessons learned out of these 2 regional reviews that have happened are that there was no, presentations were not really didn't really necessarily have a regional scope, but it's a start. Let's say it's a start, and perhaps by the time we come around to the IMRF, people will have looked back and learned. And definitely more needs to be done before the IMRF, and I agree with all speakers, and not only by civil society. There are other regional bodies that perhaps, or regional entities that perhaps are just as fit to look at regional consultations, the interstate consultation mechanisms, and sometimes, William, you're very active in one of them, at least, if not 2, in fact, Colombo process and Abu Dhabi. And perhaps that's another forum where some of these regional approaches, irrespective of whether the member states themselves of these consultative processes do support the GCM, the fact that they are in regional consultative processes means that they abide by a regional approach to things, or at least the need to look at migration and migration corridors in a consultative, constructive, regular way. So a lot to be done, but we have started. So I have given you a few examples of practical examples of partnership at the GCM level. With respect, I was asked to also say something about IOM's approach to partnership. Well, of course, we didn't. It's not because of the GCM that we're looking at partnerships. Without working together with a number of other partners, we wouldn't have been able to do what we do, especially, and starting from the very inception of IOM in 1951, and we do celebrate 70 years this year. And in fact, it would be interesting to with our partners, look back at how we have all evolved in the last 70 years and how we all look at migration very differently nowadays. Having said that, our constitution refers to partnerships and warns us that without cooperating with other entities, including NGOs, we won't be able to go anywhere. We have abided by the humanitarian principles of partnership, 2007. Our migration governance framework also says and predicates to us and states and other partners that that good migration governance can only be achieved through strong partnerships. We have a strategic vision that also refers to the need to collaborate if we want to pursue the pillars of resilience, governance, and mobility. And I could go on with respect to a number of partnerships that we are members of, not necessarily do we lead. Starting with skills mobility partnerships, where private sector, local society, and international organizations come together to look at specific issues on labor migration. Within the GFMD, I think, was it John, was it Colin that mentioned the GFMD, the Global Forum on Migration and Development? The mayor's mechanism is an example of partnership, where we have come together with a number of local government representatives to look at partnerships at an intermediate level. And in fact, the question is, are partnerships better pursued from an intermediate level rather than the national level in order to push from the bottom up? There's been a number of good examples, not least the whole migration narratives initiative of the mayor's mechanism.
Thanks. Let me just intervene here and to say thank you for that. I will ask you a question then. If I ask you, and thank you for being so straight and upfront as well on some of this. Many would say that UN network, in terms of implementing the in a certain sense, looking into the responsible for the implementation, is already a partnership in terms of different agencies coming together. And some of us know also how difficult that has been in the past, kind of thing, and some previous experiments that have not gone well, kind of thing. And partnerships in the end have to be held accountable as well. You don't go into partnership. So let me ask you then, in terms of towards the IMRF, and as we come to the IMRF, what is the one thing you would like to see and be held accountable for in terms of partnerships in relation to Objective 23?
Well, was it Poem that said that we need to start analyzing partnerships? And so it's not the fact that you have a partnership, but what is the effect of that partnership? What has it produced? And in fact, I think it's about shared principles, as Colin has said, mutual trust, but it's also about, so what do we do with this? Where do we go? What have we achieved? And how far do we have to go? So I think it's really about not only saying, as I have, let me predicate on myself, not only saying we partner, but what is it that has been achieved? But let's, and in this respect, with respect to COVID, we should not but pay homage to the Gavi Alliance and the COVAX initiative, because that's a great example of a partnership. So yes, it's true that a lot needs to be done, but we need to think not outside of the box. That sounds very trite, but there are all sorts of examples of partnerships that can be counted, because was it Ghana? And then Ivory Coast today that got vaccines thanks to the COVAX Alliance. We're also part of it, but so is the private sector. So a great example. And I think yes. So please don't do what I did, or rather, I would tell my colleagues it's not just a question of listing, but also of so what's happened with these partnerships. And the GCM should have happened with the partnerships, because that's the glue. So yes, one can start from behind, but then it's the engine, as you say. It depends what kind of car you have, of course. But what has happened to the GCM through those partnerships? So yes, we can talk about partnerships. What has happened with respect to so get the 23rd and say and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So. Am I being too sophisticated or too whatever? Anyway.
No, I think that's very real. And I think that is very important. And I think that is how we should, like Colin said as well, and others have said, when we come to this point 4 years from now, next year in the IMRF, we should be able to say, what have we done? And it has to go beyond principles, beyond working guidelines and things like that, things that remain on the shelf. And it has to be assessed on the ground. What has it changed? What has it changed? Because this is a moment crying out for change. And our coming together needs to make that happen, needs to realize that change for a future to happen, for a future to be realized. So thank you for that. Thank you so much for that. Okay, now I know that there are the chat box has become active. I'm going to ask all the panelists, if you have time, look at the chat box. I find it very difficult to manage this and look at the chat box at the same time. But if you see issues there that you want to raise, please raise them. I will come to you. But before I come to you, I see that there are people in the panel, and I'm going to do a very, very quick round just to get your sense of your impression of what has been said today, and an idea maybe that you want to put forward today, but it cannot be more than a minute. It cannot be more than a minute. So the rules are no thank yous, no appreciations, nothing about the webinar in the past and things like that. Come straight to the point. I'm going to call the people, and I'm going to ask Sada to keep and Rakesh to keep an eye on the people I'm calling in case they might need to be unmuted. I see Ambassador Nahida Soban. I will ask you. I see Sophie or Colin. John mentioned Sophie is here, who is responsible for the mayor's mechanism. I see Binod Kadaria here as well, and I'm glad he is with us today. I see Shabri from the ILO here. That's good to have him on board as well. I see I see Stefan Rother as well. I see Patrick Taran, Evelyn, Eva. I see Star, who used to handle the support unit of the GFMD, who has been a faithful observer in this entire 23 series. I would like to call on her as well. And I see Sumi. I will ask each of you again 1 minute interventions. I'll start with Ambassador Nahida Soban. Please, 1 minute intervention. Madam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, William. I cannot but appreciate the whole event. Particularly, I'm so glad to see so many of old friends. So I'm really glad to be a part of it. Now, my 1 minute. Firstly, about the civil society space. I think there are a number of mechanisms within the UN, and I would urge the civil society members, all who are present here, and also those who are outside, to please use those mechanisms to raise your voice. I give you an example. You have to be a member of the ECOSOC, civil society space, and then you can get access to all the UN events and the sessions. There are a number of resolutions and discussions under ECOSOC, Third Committee of UNGA, and also the Human Rights Council. And particularly in the Human Rights Council, there is a particular resolution on civil society space. But I have not seen anybody talking about civil society, those who work on migrants and migrants being a part of civil society, being included in those resolutions. So there I think that a lot of need from your organization and all the other civil society people who are here today to raise your voice, engage with that resolutions and with those states who sponsored those resolutions, and make your voice and have the inclusion for the civil society space in the discussions on migrations in these areas. So that's one point. My second point, which I have already mentioned to you, William, is about the big, huge gap that I see, we all see, and some of you have already talked about it, is the gap between the declaration that was adopted in 2016 high-level meeting on large movement of refugees and migrants, which everybody agreed to, all the UN members agreed to, and the large gap in what we see about the Objective 23 in the GCM. In the declaration that was adopted in 2016, we had cooperation on search and rescue operations. We had cooperation on to benefit the humanity, about data collection, consular access and protection, cooperation for facilitating migration, and return and readmission. None of these are here in the Objective 23. So we need to talk about it in our next courses of reviews. And my third point is about, this is about globalization. Migration is part of globalization, and we have failed to recognize that or speak readily about it. So that needs to be flagged everywhere. And in that regard, I would urge all of the civil society members to knock WTO, where we have a big chunk of discussion on globalizations and access to goods and services as well. So knock WTO, and migration should be included there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you so much for those very valuable suggestions. Explore every avenue, exploit every avenue. Thank you so much for that idea. I will now call on Sophie Van Hasten. I don't see her. John mentioned that she's on the call, but Sophie, if you're there. And Sada, there's a request that from Angie, can we possibly open the option to send chat to everyone, so we can get an opportunity to also read the thoughts of other participants.
Okay.
So kindly open the chat to everyone. We'll close it if again we are bombarded with spam or whatever. But Sophie, are you there? If Sophie is not there, then I will call Binod. Binod, sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William. Thank you very much. I was pleasantly surprised by your opening remarks and reminding me of what I had completely forgotten in these last 23 weeks. And I must congratulate all of you for your perseverance through these 23. I think this is an example of partnership, of sustainable partnership. And unfortunately, that is not so much visible when we think about migration. I think we talk. I think Nicolette's presentation was very inspiring. In fact, calling a spade, that what is it that is the outcome? What is it that is the final outcome of the so-called partnerships? And if at the ground level, if we look at the migrants, the process, the logistics of migration itself has not become easier. It has become more and more difficult, as I have just now put it in the chat box also. At the ground level, when you look at the nitty-gritties of the process of migration, it begins with an application for visa. And that has been made more and more difficult by countries unilaterally and without any help, in the sense that because pandemic has taken away jobs, because people are less in numbers in helping, the helplines, at the end of the helpline, you just go in circles. You get a reference to another website, and then there's no human voice to help you. And that happens to highly educated people as applicants. And you can imagine, we can imagine the plight of the people who are not fortunate enough to have that level of education to actually handle web or online applications on about making visa application as the first step of migration. So this is just an example that we may have to address at the very ground level what is involved in making migration safe, orderly, and regular.
Thank you so much. Thank you for starting from the very basic thing that is required for mobility across borders today for so many people in so many parts of the world, just that visa. So thank you for that. Shabri, your 1 minute, ILO perspective. Shabri Nair?
Thanks. Thanks so much, William. And because you've said no words of thanks, I'll just say all protocols observed, as we usually say in such contexts. Yeah. Well, it was Nahida, ma'am, the ambassador from Bangladesh, who we are so always good to have her here, mentioned about the WTO. The newest WTO Director General is an African and is a woman. And for the first time, an African and a woman, who then went on to say, we all know how difficult her own appointment was, who then goes to say that perhaps vaccinations should be applied across the board and see governments be able to put forward their resources to support those who will not be able to afford it. This goes back to what Poem mentioned about why Objective 23 came forward in the first place. Forget migration then, even in the context of vaccinations, where we always say, even if one person is not safe, the entire world is not safe. We are not able to adhere to the issues pertaining to international cooperation. You know, if we look at it along those lines, John mentioned about acting in ways we haven't before, which you reiterated, William. Acting in ways which we haven't before requires us to be able to sometimes take a leap of faith, taking a risk. How many of us in international fora are used to constantly hearing the term low-hanging fruits? We like to go for those low-hanging fruits, whatever best we can achieve. Well, for once, maybe, let us all within the international community say, let's aim for the sky. And if we get to the ceiling, then that would be an achievement when it comes to strengthening partnerships, because that is something that we are not yet doing in the context of migration. Nicoletta spoke about regional partnerships. Well, there is a disconnect between global and what is happening at the global level to what is happening at the regional, national, and local levels. How do we bridge this gap? Because these spaces are extremely uneven. Final point from my side, and that is with regards to partnerships between UN agencies and the space for partnerships and the platform for partnerships that the UN is supposed to provide. In that sense, I think we need to also self-reflect as UN to see what it is that we are doing wrong, what it is that we can do better, and how is it that we can make sure that this is not just going to be lip service, that we don't use partnerships, the term, for the sake of using it. I'll stop there. Thanks, William.
And thank you for that. And thank you as somebody coming from the UN agency to be able to say, yes, a self-assessment is required as well. Thanks for that thought. Stefan Jagnan. Stefan? Stefan?
Sorry. Yes, William.
Go ahead.
Hi.
1 minute.
Yes, no, thank you. I think it was really, really a great webinar, and I would say a great series. And it's great that we can finish with the one on international cooperation. I don't want to sound too cynical, but I believe that to some extent, number 23 might be the less problematic for a number of governments, because we even see governments which have negative migration policies being open to cooperation as long as they control the narrative. So I guess what is important is that we link basically international cooperation with the content of the 22 other objectives. So let's talk about international cooperation when we talk about irregular migration, and let's talk about a cooperation when we try to find alternatives to detention. So for me, it's extremely important. 23 is vital, but is less problematic for government if they can just do the usual, talking together, but without moving on content. So very important to link 23 with each of the objectives. So thank you, and thanks a lot for organizing these wonderful webinars.
And thank you for being optimistic. Do what you do and do it well to governments. This is what we must say. Great. Rola? Okay, Rola is not coming on. Patrick Taran? Patrick Taran is, Rola is coming on?
Hi,
Go
William.
ahead. Go ahead. Quickly, 1 minute.
Yes, no, it was a great webinar. I think I agree with some of the points about, trying to look at new ways of doing what we do. I think that was a point made by John very well. And trying to find new alliances that we can put in place to achieve this international cooperation that we spoke about. But also in terms of, I think it's interesting that the picture is sometimes a little bit unequal, because some objectives, they have a drive, they have a life of their own, regardless of the compact, and they get lumped into initiatives of international cooperation, whereas other kind of objectives are not necessarily, get the same attention. And I think for some of the people who are trying to push the agenda forward, it's a question of how do we make this uniformly happen? How do we get the more kind of difficult questions asked and the more difficult objective handled? So I guess how can we use international operation as a guiding principle across the board is something that I think would be kind of interesting to look at as well. Thanks. That's one minute.
That's great. How do we get the guiding principle across? Thanks. Thank you so much for that. Patrick Taran? Ellen Sana? If Patrick Taran is not there, Ellen Sana? Ellen Sana is not there.
If Patrick is there, I'll just.
Okay, Patrick Taran, Ellen Sana, Stefan Rother. Okay, Stefan. Okay. All right, fine. Stefan is I said he's got another call to attend to. Ellen is not coming on. Sumi. All right, Sumi is also not coming on for some reason. If even Ellen is not coming on. Ellen, you can't come on, or you're...
William.
Okay, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, because I step out and I just joined in. So,
All right.
Really apology.
All right. Okay, Sumita unable to mute. Sumita.
Thank you, William. It's been a good seminar, webinar for all the 23 objectives. And I think the last objective is extremely crucial because all the 22 objectives can only happen if there is international cooperation and collaboration among the governments. But I must say that I have seen during the pandemic where governments have been using the pandemic as a reason to churn out policies that are very nationalistic and ignoring international corporations. So I think that is something civil society must take on board and must be aware I'm a bit cautious when governments are hiding behind the pandemic. So I think society should read in between the lines of the policies that the governments are churning out. It may look good nationally, but then what is the impact on international migration and on the migrants themselves? Yeah, that's my input. Thank you.
Very important, the need to be discerning. Let me ask Star. Star, do you want to come in here? Star is Estrella. I do.
Hello,
Okay.
William. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead, Star.
Hi. Well. First, big congratulations to you and your team. I know you said not to, but this is the last, and I'd like to take advantage of that opportunity to really recognize you. You have just demonstrated, I think, through this series of webinars, what a real partnership in dialogue and action means. And as you know, partnerships and international cooperation, these have been part of the DNA of the Global Forum. And indeed, in the last 13 years, the GFMD has demonstrated what it means to establish partnerships and to do international cooperation by providing what Ambassador Pietro Mona said as the 3 S's, space, substance, and stakeholder. And I think even especially now, as we go about the implementation of the Global Compact, and really in our attempt to breathe life into this compact, that we need to remember that these 3 S's still matter. And I think that has been the added value of the GFMD through the years. But this is also a continuing work in progress. And in the last summit meeting, I think Roundtable 6 highlighted that we still need to work on certain elements to make these partnerships and international cooperation really work for migrants and migration in general. And that's the availability of financial resources, the need to do monitoring and evaluation, and the flexibility, the agility to adapt to changing circumstances. So we still have work to do, whether in the GFMD or outside, but I think it's good to use this opportunity to remind everyone of the model that we have already, what the GFMD has shown. It's still not a perfect model, but I hope that it will continue. Thank you.
Thank you for pointing that out, and for partnerships to have the agility and the flexibility to respond to circumstances. Very well taken, that point, especially in this time of COVID. Eva Sanders? Eva Sanders? Go ahead, Eva. Eva, you just got to unmute.
Okay. Hi,
Perfect.
everybody. I'm technically incompetent, as you can see. I just want to say, first of all, let's remain positive. Secondly, let's remain with all our partnerships, fine, but let's remain independent. Let's not be absorbed. Let's move forward better, and let's continue to make sure that we know on what issue we want to have the review and how we can move faster. And very many thanks to you, William, for this fantastic possibility. And maybe there could be a webinar sometime where we could take again up these questions, right, so we don't forget it, and that we get to be quite specific, maybe in terms of having people who were on all of this come back and say, how we can move faster and on what issue. Thank you.
Great. Just to say, we will go over 10 minutes. I want to go back to the panel. Please indulge me. This is the last in the series. Please indulge me. We will go over 10 minutes. But very quickly, the last two, my co-moderator, Paddy. Paddy?
Unmute.
Perfect.
Hi, William. I think I have spoken enough along these webinars, and so I had just left some questions for some of our panelists to respond to, which really speak into, you know, the role of evidence. For instance, I think Nicoletta, it would have been interesting to hear a little bit more about, you know, what is the role of evidence as we are, as I see it, it's sort of a monitoring process in terms of the GCM. And a very direct question, sometimes I keep thinking, are we going to shrink it? You know, are there some of those milestones? And I think it's a question that I also raised to Poem, who came back in the chat. Do we really foresee some of those milestones shrinking if we made progress on some of them? So it's a bit of a hypothetical future question on a GCM 2.0. You know, what does that look like? And if we do have the ability, for instance, when we've talked about legal pathways as one of them, and I think Professor Kadre had also touched on it, you know, having the ability to come with objectives that we know we would implement, but also knowing, trying to drive at some that have been sticking around for a little bit too long. So maybe a challenge that goes out also to our panelists as they will respond to the questions. And thanks again, William, for this 1 minute.
Thank you. Thanks, Paddy. And last, before I go to the panel, I started by saying my good friend Farooq. I want to call Anisur Rahman from Awaz Foundation, who had co-founded Warbi with Farooq and some other returned migrants. Anisur knew Farooq as a friend, and I would like Anisur to take that last moment before we go back to the panel. Anisur?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. William, and thank you others, especially to I dedicated this program to the soul of my best friend, late Farooq. Farooq was a great friend of migrant workers. We worked together 5 years in Saudi Arabia. We were good friends. He was victimized. He was victimized by wrong medical diagnosis and surgeries on his good kidney instead of bad one. Farooq believed it was negligence with him being a migrant worker, and on the last day of his life, he fought for his justice, but could not ensure this justice. However, I came to the about this GCM 23 issues. 23 is very important, and all 23 is important. All 23 is important, and I think our partnership already build up. Unwritten partnership build up. We got the support from other international organizations, other countries, and other partners also. Though migration is a global issue, it's mandatory to build partnership, and we need partnership with the government and others, national, international network for the interest of migrants and being a migrant workers. And we think sometimes we have to make partnership for the interest of migrants against those will be harmful for the migrants. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And we remember your friend as a colleague of ours who struggled with us hand in hand. I now go back to the panel. You have heard a lot. You have read a lot in the chat box, and I'm sure there's a lot to say, but we have very limited time. I will go back starting from the reverse side, starting with Nicoletta. 1.5 minutes, please. Nicoletta?
Yes, yes. So yes, I agree. I was trying to, in fact, respond on the chat, but somehow, yeah, Eva, I share your incompetence. But just to say, yes, accountability is key. But so are indicators. So and we look at indicators at at the national level, regional level? I mean, how do we go about standards? You know, what standards do we agree on? One would think that some indicators are very specific. So, you know, we have 23 objectives, or perhaps 22, because the 23rd is the filter. And you know, how many indicators for all objectives if we are to measure? And do we need to measure all of the objectives is the question. But yes, it is food for thought, and food for thought for us all. Yes, I agree with Paddy. More needs to be, you know, this whole issue of how to measure and what to measure needs to be thought of further. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. And let's think about this. It's an important thought to think about, even as we think of coming up to the review. John.
Yeah, thanks, William. Yeah, I want to agree also with Eva. You know, partnerships are not automatic, and they're not scientific, and they're not boring, and they're not risk-free, that's for sure. But partners seize opportunities, and they look for action and progress and solutions based on a shared interest. But shared interest is not shared identity. You know, in fact, partners come together with different identities to bring different capacities. And so civil society, with business, with international organizations, with anyone else, with governments, they have to have the sense and the courage to cross the bridge, but stay who we are. And lastly, you know, partnerships are rarely everyone together. They're rarely for all purposes, or I said before, they're rarely forever. So it's not all of society, all of government, not each partnership. It's ideally partnerships fit within those categories, but they're specific partners for specific issues of shared interest, common ground, and purpose. And we have to, in civil society, like the other actors, not lose our identities in these broader processes, whether they're governments, UN, or funders. Because if we lose our identities, we not only lose who we are, but we lose our value as a partner. Thanks.
Thanks for that, John. Let's not romanticize partnerships. Let's be very real about it and let them become transformative. And that should be the way we assess them. Thanks a lot. Sumaya?
Yes. You asked the cooperation about the government support mechanism. Yes, Bangladesh government is trying to support, but that is not enough. And already our ambassador told us that we should make collective voice and make more united effort to achieve the migrant workers' rights. And government, just I'd like to mention during the pandemic that we have one successful case history that for extremely outcome for policy advocacy, all partners, especially we was very close with NSRC, BNSK, NSRC, Bangladesh, and other civil society, BNWL, trade union. KSA court verdict, death sentence of main accused Abiron employers, wife for this sentence, and 3 years jail for another employers. This is a historical judgment for Bangladesh. This is the first time we get this report. But the thing is, without the collaboration with destination country, even their law and other mechanism, if that cannot support the migrant worker, then we cannot achieve the migrant workers' rights and both country. And we should more focus on support service mechanism. That is for the country of destination and country of origin also. And collaboration with interministerial activities and collaboration, we should use the Colombo process and Abu Dhabi dialogue. And we should, for action plan for GCM, and more focus on 23 objective. That is, though it is last one, but that is very strengthening, powerful. That's strengthening international cooperation, global partnership for safe, orderly, and regional cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I like that point about we must be able to measure our success. You can't keep the engine running and not move forward. So thank you for that. Poem?
Yes, thanks, William. Just to start by indicating that I have responded to the issue raised by Paddy on the chat. Coming to my concluding remarks, I want to build on what Nicolata, John, and Colin said about partnerships, including inclusivity. In my view, I think the first International Migration Review Forum will be dominated by partnerships, including, by the way, international cooperation, which we have been discussing in detail here, and of course, inclusivity. And then, yes, your co-host made reference to the role of evidence. And precisely like what I was saying in my presentation, we need credible information and data for us to assess progress and indeed redirect our efforts if necessary. And lastly, I want to say the GCM itself is very flexible. It's a flexible framework that seeks to accommodate everyone in all different situations. And that is the same with the Objective 23. If you religiously go through it, you discover that all of us, we are accommodated. So I want to end by saying this session was an eye-opener to me coming from the other sister region. And I was even, as we were discussing, I was discussing with my colleagues that I think we need to emulate what the Migration Forum in Asia is doing. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and that's a good point. Let us not be afraid to redirect our efforts if necessary. Very good point in looking at partnerships. Colin and Sada, I'll ask you to be ready to flash the poster, which we'll do after Colin speaks. Okay. Okay, Colin, go ahead.
Thanks, William. I think, I had this long list of complaints about shrinking civil society space and all of that. But then I heard the wise voice of Eva Sanders come on and saying, be positive. So I'm going to take Eva's guidance to be positive and kind of turn this around a little bit. One of the things when we talk about looking towards the IMRF, in 2019, we had the IMRF modalities resolution, and we were very engaged in the negotiations for the resolution. One of the things that we strongly pushed for was not just ECOSOC status and the non-objection clause and all of those technicalities, but we also pushed for self-organizing of civil society. We applauded the modalities resolution for coming up with a space for stakeholder consultations, but we asked for self-organizing, and there is precedent for this. We can look not too far back as in 2013 at the high-level dialogue, the UN high-level dialogue on migration and development, where there was this independent civil society steering committee that worked with the UN agencies and the President of the General Assembly's office in terms of developing who should speak and when and how the stakeholders intervene and all of those mechanics of it, which are so important on this. And I mentioned already the GFMD and how we've some of the spaces we've been doing that for a while now. But I also want to lift up some of the other good practices of cooperation and partnership that we've been engaged in. I'm really glad to have Nicolata here because, Nicolata heads up the division of IOM that has partnerships in her name. And I want to congratulate Nicolata and her team for for supporting civil society and I know civil society, we have our level of organization is very complicated. There's layers and layers of organization. It can be very hard to understand. But we've been in dialogue and we've built this sort of mutual trust and understanding so that Nicolata and her team, which is doing so much, has been very supportive in civil society and engaging in their regular dialogues that they're having, and even opening the door today in terms of how we can approach the celebration and recognition of the 70th anniversary of IOM together. So we really want to acknowledge that. And finally, just to say that kind of taking what John just mentioned about shared interest and how we build from that. In my years of working in the global civil society sort of coordination space, I don't think civil society, at least the group of a civil society that are engaged at this level, and which is quite diverse in and of itself, I don't think we have that much differences in terms of our shared interests and shared principles. Where actually there's a lot of common ground. But where we have trouble building trust with each other and then going beyond that with other stakeholders is how we approach that. What are our strategies and our approaches? And I think this is where we get clouded by our own organizational profiles, as I mentioned right at the start. And I want to end by challenging ourselves first and all other stakeholders as we approach the IMRF. And I agree with John. I think we need to, have a sense of urgency, but I also wanted us to take the long view. Even if we don't accomplish now, we need to start now. We need to look at the long view and how we need to approach this in a very different way than how we've been doing it recently. And I think we have all the indications here that we've talked about so far. So I'm very encouraged by that.
Thanks, Colin. Some important words from today's webinar: act like we haven't acted before. Act multilaterally or die. Don't be afraid of redirecting our efforts. Start, act now. There's a lot that we discussed today in terms of Objective 23. It is the motor, it is the glue. We have to keep moving. We have to be positive. Change is upon us. I always write at the end of my communication. And in this webinar, we have seen it, we have talked about it, and we have shared stories of people who have come before us and people who we have accompanied in the struggle. So let's keep this going. And just to show you that we ourselves are committed to this and we ourselves have grown in this process kind of thing, I will ask Sada, I said at the beginning, this is not over for us. I'm asking Sada to flash. And before you have a poster, which in our reflections, we thought in this 3 series, there were some issues that came up as very big issues on which we need to push the agenda, we need to develop partnerships, and we need to see transformation on the ground. Issues like detention and returns, migration, COVID, and social protections and social protections, race and discrimination, regular pathways and irregular migration. We will have from between 12th to the April to 12th of May, a series of these webinars based on these 4 topics, and each of these topics will start off a separate stream of conversation in preparation to the global forums, International Migration Review Forum, rather, which is scheduled for next year. So we are hoping to get a perspective from the ground of what needs to be transformed, what is transforming, and what are the challenges in relation to these 4 issues, which were some of the key issues and some of the most contested debates that we had in this 23 series workshops. So, and we are hoping that from each of these discussions, a stream of conversation will take off, that will build that a mobilization will be built around, so that when we do come to the review itself, next year in New York, we will have something very tangible to look at and to say that this is what the view from the ground looks like. This is what has changed. This is what needs to change. So please join us in this series. And if you have ideas to share on any of this, on any of the themes, our process is always open. You are free to write to us, reach out to us, tell us how you can be or wish to be part of this. So feel free about that. But before I end, let me ask my very good colleague Sada, who has been in the background in the entire 23-hour process, he and his team who have managed it. I want Sada, if you could come forward to say some last words, a few last words.
Thank you, William. In fact, we only supported you. You have been mentoring us, frankly speaking. And it is Sabri is here, Rola is here. They brought us together, and since then we didn't look back. And this webinar series, in fact, GCM series is a marathon which was possible largely because of you and your team and our team also. Rakesh is there, Firoz is there, Abhishek, all of them. And our participants, they have been very, participatory also throughout the process. And I feel we have made some big attempt, some very effective attempt to make this GCM review series fruitful with the new generation, especially having, debating on this issue, and many partnerships, which are objective of today's webinar. We made many partnership, many kind of network. With all this, I think effectively we can do evaluation and also march forward. I have many things to say, but I think with this word, I'll stop.
Thank you so much, and thank you to each one of you. I see we are still 167 participants in this webinar. Thank you for staying on. Can I request, if possible, I don't know how to do this myself, but if anybody can you put on your cameras and let's just take screenshots of this last series, last in the 23 series. If everybody could put their cameras on, if it's okay, and then let's do this sign. This sign, which is, let's say, today it is a sign of moving forward. Let's move forward, right? And
End slavery.
Yes.
That's for Western.
Let's move forward, moving forward. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody, each one of you who made it possible. There are 7 pages. You can go to page 2 to see the people on page 2. Fantastic, good site. 167 people right up to the very end. This is something fantastic, and I really think it is great to have each of you on this. Please feel free at any time to visit any of the co-organizers' websites to check up for updates on this or to the outcomes of this. We are coming up with policy briefs on each of these, so this should be there. But thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists for a great session today.
Thank you, William. That is only possible from a migrant from Asia. Thank you all, and
thank you.
CRFD also to support MFA. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you, everyone.
Hello.
If I could, I would raise resources when COVID ever allows us all to come together face to face. Wouldn't it be fantastic if everybody who has attended all 23 webinars came together and met in one place? Imagine how transformative that moment would be for each one of us. But
William, please visit Bangladesh. At a time you can visit the Rohingya camp also. Take all your team to Bangladesh. We can arrange meeting here. And longest series in Bangladesh. Please visit us.
For sure. I would like to suggest for those who are in India, who have been on this webinar from India, if you all could, whenever things get better, maybe GFRTD can organize a meeting of all those who are in India to come together. We in the Philippines would be happy to do that. In other parts of the world, if there are a number of you who have attended from cities together, it might be good to meet up in cities as a group and then to connect again. But that might be an idea worth following. We'd be happy for all those who are from the Philippines at some stage to be able to meet together face to face when life turns back to some kind of normal. But that would be good. I can see.
We'll try our best. Actually, once we thought like that, but now I think things are opening up. People are moving, so we can think of.
Sure.
That is a great idea. What you mentioned, William. BNS is happy to organize meeting in Bangladesh. If you are interested, and if even Bangladeshi students who already joined there, even from our organization, there is 3 students is there. Thank you for a great initiative. This is wonderful for COVID time. But for our physical meeting, BNSK is ready to cooperate and host this program. If you want, we are ready all the time. Thank you.
To Eva Sanders and Eva Ritzer, we look forward to being together at the IMRF face to face. See you in New York.
Dr. Raj, anything you want to say?
You are muted, Dr. Raj.
1 minute.
No, it's not.
All right. She's still not been able to unmute, but let me take your leave as I have to go to attend another webinar now.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Thank you all.
Okay, I said I want to thank all the organizers and the panelists, and I have to say I shall be missing these series because it has become part of our routine, like going to work. So I look forward to the next set of activities. Take care. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We'll be
Bye.
starting again from 12th.